Teacher humiliates student. Little did he know he'd be embarrassed in front of everyone. Brian Thomas Johnson felt his whole body tremble when Professor Richard Harrison tore up his astronomy project in front of all his classmates. The muffled laughter from the popular kids only made the 13-year-old boy's humiliation harder to hide. "This is what happens when mediocre students try to talk about things they don't understand," the teacher said, tossing the shredded paper onto the desk. "Do you really think you'll get anywhere in life with this kind of shallow research, Johnson?" Brian swallowed his tears as he returned to his seat. That project had taken weeks of research at the only library in the small town of Blue Ridge, in rural North Carolina. To make matters worse, this was his last chance to improve his grade and avoid repeating the year. "I expect you to come back next class with something decent," the teacher said, adjusting his striped tie. "Or don't even bother showing up." The bell rang, signaling the end of class. Brian was the first one out. He wanted to get home as soon as possible. The dirt road connecting Franklin Adams Public School to his house had never felt so long. The evening sky began to darken, matching his mood. Grandma Martha, his 78-year-old grandmother, was sitting on the porch of their small brick house when he arrived. Since his parents had left to try their luck in Chicago and never returned, she had raised him on the little she got from her Social Security check. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, noticing his red eyes. "Nothing, Grandma," he lied quickly, heading inside to the room he sometimes shared with his cousin. That night was tough. Brian tossed and turned, thinking about what to do. He couldn't repeat the year. His grandmother had already mentioned to the neighbor that if it happened, he might have to quit school and start working to help with household expenses. By sunrise, Brian was already up. He had made a decision. He wouldn't give up. He'd redo the project, this time with even more dedication. Before school, he stopped by the local library, which opened early thanks to the dedicated librarian, Mrs. Wilson. "Good morning, Brian. What brings you here so early?" asked the kind, grey-haired woman with her hair in a bun. "I need to research more about astronomy, Mrs. Wilson. Professor Richard said my project was too shallow." The librarian's expression changed instantly at the mention of the teacher's name. "Ah, Professor Richard." She shook her head. "You know, Brian, I just got some new books on the subject, and there are a few old science magazines that might help." Brian spent nearly an hour at the library before heading to school. On the way, he thought about how he'd face his classmates after yesterday's humiliation. As he entered the classroom, just as he expected, a few snickers and whispers followed him to his seat. That day's class was with teacher Sarah Miller, a young, recently graduated English teacher. Unlike Professor Richard, she always treated her students with respect and care. "Brian, could you stay a minute after class?" she asked, as everyone left for break. The boy nodded, bracing himself for another scolding. To his surprise, when the room emptied, the teacher smiled kindly. "I heard what happened yesterday," she said quietly. "Professor Richard shouldn't have acted that way. I saw your project before he tore it up. It was very well done." Brian looked at her, surprised by her words. "But he said it was shallow, that I didn't know what I was talking about. Let me tell you a secret." The teacher leaned in closer. "Professor Richard acts this way with many students. It's not you, it's just his manner. He thinks humiliating students will motivate them, but it only achieves the opposite." That conversation was a balm for Brian. Knowing he wasn't the only one suffering from the teacher's behavior made him feel less alone. Teacher Sarah even offered some of her personal books to help him with his new research. In the following days, Brian dedicated every free minute to redoing his work. He kept returning to the library, researched online whenever he could use the school's only available computer. His grandmother noticed the change in her grandson's behavior, always studying late into the night, but chose not to interfere, believing it was just dedication to his studies. On a particularly chilly June afternoon, Brian found something interesting among the old science magazines Mrs. Wilson had set aside for him. It was an article published nearly 20 years ago, written by none other than Richard Harrison, his current teacher. "Theory of the Accelerated Expansion of Peripheral Galaxies, A New Approach," the title read. Brian began reading with curiosity. The article proposed a theory that, according to the text, would revolutionize the understanding of the universe. There were complex calculations, colorful graphs, and citations from other scientists. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot, as we're just starting out. Now continuing. As he turned the page, Brian found something that left him stunned. It was a letter to the editor of the journal, published 3 months after the original article. In it, a renowned astronomer from MIT pointed out serious errors in Richard's calculations, demonstrating that his theory didn't hold up against the scientific evidence accepted at the time. I regret to inform you that Mr. Harrison's work contains fundamental flaws in its premises, one passage read. His calculations ignore basic principles of quantum physics applied to astronomy, rendering his conclusions invalid. Brian couldn't believe what he was reading. His teacher, the same one who humiliated students for the smallest mistakes, had published a scientific paper with major errors. Continuing his research, he found other mentions of the article, all harshly criticizing Richard's work. "Mrs. Wilson, can I make copies of these pages?" he asked the librarian, who agreed right away. With the copies carefully tucked into his backpack, Brian headed home, his mind buzzing with ideas. He wasn't entirely sure what he'd do with the information, but he felt it might be useful somehow. The days passed, and the deadline for presenting. His new project drew closer. Brian had put great care into every detail, every reference, every image. He'd even built a small model of the solar system using recycled materials he'd collected around the neighborhood. The night before the presentation, his grandmother called him into the living room. "Brian, the principal called me today," she said with a serious expression. "He said you're at risk of repeating the year and that you need to get a very good grade on this astronomy project." The boy's heart tightened. His grandmother already had enough to worry about. Her blood pressure had been high, and the doctor at the community clinic had advised her to avoid stress. "It'll be okay, Grandma. I put a lot of effort into this project. It'll work out." He tried to reassure her, hiding his own anxiety. That night, Brian barely slept. Besides worrying about the presentation, he kept thinking about what to do with the information he'd uncovered about the teacher. Would it be ethical to use it against him? Wouldn't it be better to just focus on doing a good job? Morning came quickly. Brian gathered his materials, carefully packed the model into a cardboard box, and headed to school. He was so nervous, he didn't even feel hungry for the breakfast his grandmother had lovingly prepared. Upon entering the classroom, he noticed an unusual buzz. The students were more restless than usual, and he soon discovered why. The school principal and some parents would be present during the science project presentations. "It's a new school initiative," explained Emily, one of the few classmates who had always treated Brian with kindness. "The principal wants to show parents how we're learning. It'll be like an open class." The news only heightened Brian's nervousness. Facing humiliation in front of his classmates was one thing, but going through it in front of adults, including the principal, was entirely different. Teacher Sarah Miller met him in the hallway before class began. "Are you ready?" she asked with an encouraging smile. "I think so," he replied uncertainly. "But I'm nervous about this whole thing with the parents and the principal." "Don't worry, I made sure to be here too. Remember, you studied hard and know what you're talking about. Trust yourself." Sarah's words gave Brian a little more confidence. The first class passed like a blur in his mind, his anxiety so great for the arrival of second period, when science class with Professor Richard Harrison would take place. When the moment finally came, Brian saw the professor enter the room, followed by the principal and about 6 parents. Among them, he recognized Emily's mother, a respected doctor in their small town. "Today we'll have a special class," announced the professor with a smile Brian had never seen before. "Our students will present their projects on astronomy, a fascinating topic that expands the horizons of human knowledge." Brian sensed the hypocrisy in those words. The professor who had torn up his work now spoke as if he truly cared about the students' learning. The presentations began with the so-called top students in the class. The professor lavished exaggerated praise, even when some projects were basic and lacked depth. The parents applauded proudly after each conclusion. "Now, let's see if Mr. Johnson managed to improve his work," said the professor, finally calling on Brian. His tone made it clear he didn't expect much. With trembling legs, Brian stood and walked to the front of the room, carrying his model and notes. He took a deep breath, as Sarah had advised, and began his presentation. My project is about the structure of the universe and the latest theories on its expansion. He started, surprising everyone with the steadiness in his voice. I'll discuss the Big Bang Theory, the accelerated expansion of the universe, and the scientific evidence supporting these theories. With each slide he showed, each explanation he gave, Professor Richard's expression grew tenser. Brian spoke knowledgeably about complex topics, citing recent sources and explaining difficult concepts clearly and accessibly. When he reached the model demonstration, he precisely illustrated planetary movements and explained the true proportions of the solar system, which were impossible to represent to scale in a model. Any questions? Brian concluded after nearly 15 minutes. The room was completely silent. The parents seemed impressed and the principal jotted notes with an approving smile. It was Professor Richard who broke the silence. Interesting, Johnson, he said, adjusting his glasses. But I see you mentioned the theory of the universe's accelerated expansion. Can you explain how that works? It's quite an advanced concept for a student at your level. It was a trap question, and Brian knew it immediately. The professor was trying to corner him, hoping he'd stumble over complex concepts. With all due respect, Professor, replied Brian, keeping his calm, the accelerated expansion of the universe is a phenomenon confirmed by astronomical observations since the late 90s. Astronomers discovered that galaxies aren't just moving away from each other, but doing so at an increasingly faster rate. The boy paused and continued. This acceleration couldn't be explained by the traditional Big Bang theory alone, which led scientists to propose the existence of dark energy, a still mysterious force that works against gravity, pushing galaxies apart. The professor's expression shifted. Clearly, he hadn't expected such a detailed and correct answer. And what about the peripheral galaxies? He pressed, visibly unsettled. Any specific theories about them? Brian hesitated for a moment. This was exactly the subject of the flawed article he'd found by the professor. Should he mention it? The doubt lasted only seconds before he made his decision. Actually, Professor, there are some theories about the behavior of peripheral galaxies, but none have been scientifically proven so far, he replied carefully. Some scientific papers tried to offer specific explanations, but they were refuted for lacking sufficient evidence or containing basic calculation errors. The professor's face paled. It was clear he'd caught the indirect reference to his own failed paper. I think we've seen enough, he said, trying to end the presentation. You may sit down, Johnson. Wait a moment, interrupted Emily's mother, standing up. I'm fascinated by this young man's presentation. I'd like to ask a few questions if the professor allows. The principal agreed immediately, ignoring Professor Richard Harrison's annoyed expression. You mentioned dark energy, the doctor said. Can you explain how it relates to dark matter? Many people confuse the two concepts. Brian smiled, grateful for the opportunity. They're completely different concepts, Doctor. Dark matter is a form of matter that doesn't interact with light or other electromagnetic radiation, so we can't see it. But we know it exists because of its gravitational effect on visible matter. Dark energy, on the other hand, is a form of energy that permeates all of space and has negative pressure, acting as a repulsive force that accelerates the universe's expansion. The answer impressed not just the doctor, but everyone present. Professor Richard seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Where did you learn all this? He asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and irritation. At the local library, Professor, Brian replied simply. I spent weeks studying books and scientific papers. Mrs. Wilson, the librarian, helped me find up-to-date material. It's impressive that a boy your age living... The professor stopped abruptly, realizing he was about to comment on Brian's family situation. Living how, Professor? Questioned the principal, noticing the hesitation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now back to the story. The professor cleared his throat, visibly embarrassed. Living in a small town like ours with limited resources, he finished, trying to cover his tracks. Actually, Professor, interjected teacher Sarah Miller, who, had been silently observing. Brian faced many challenges to complete this project. He doesn't have a computer at home, his grandmother can't afford expensive books, and yet he still produced exceptional work. The teacher's comment sparked murmurs of approval among the parents present. "I believe he deserves the highest grade. Don't you agree, Professor Richard?" suggested the principal in a tone that left no room for discussion. Before the professor could respond, Brian's phone rang. Normally, he would never answer during class, but the call was from the community clinic, and his grandmother hadn't been well lately. "May I take this, Principal?" "It might be about my grandma," he asked, worried. After getting permission, Brian quickly stepped out to answer. When he returned, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. "I need to leave," he said, his voice breaking. "My grandma got sick and was taken to the hospital." "I'll take you," Teacher Sarah immediately offered. "No, that's not necessary," Emily's mother interrupted. "My car is right outside and I'm heading to the hospital now. I can give him a ride." Professor Richard, sensing the urgency, didn't object. Brian quickly gathered his things and hurried out with the doctor. On the way to the hospital, Brian couldn't hold back his tears. His grandma was all he had, his only family. "Don't worry too much," the doctor tried to reassure him. "I'll personally take care of her when we get there." "Do you know what happened?" "The nurse just said she fainted while making lunch and the neighbor found her," he replied, wiping his tears. "She has high blood pressure, but she always takes her meds." When they arrived at the hospital, Grandma Martha was already being treated. The initial diagnosis was a hypertensive crisis, but more tests were needed to rule out serious complications. "I'll speak with the doctors on duty and monitor her case," assured Emily's mother, who was not only well respected in town, but also the clinical director of the small community hospital. Brian spent the rest of the day in the waiting room, worried not just about his grandma's health, but also about the consequences of his interrupted presentation. Would he still have enough points to pass the year? Would Professor Richard be even angrier at him because of the indirect references to his failed paper? Night fell, and finally Brian's grandma was stabilized. It wasn't serious, but she'd need to stay a few days for observation and medication adjustments. "You can see her now, but only for a few minutes," the nurse informed him. "After that, you'll need to go home. Minors can't stay overnight without a guardian." Brian entered the room where his grandma was resting. Grandma Martha looked pale but smiled when she saw him. "I'm sorry for scaring you like this, my boy," she said weakly. "You don't have to apologize for anything, Grandma," Brian replied, holding her wrinkled hand. "You'll get better soon and we'll go home." "The doctor said you were giving an important presentation at school when you heard I got sick," she murmured. "I feel bad for interrupting." "Don't worry about that. Nothing's more important than you." After the brief visit, Brian faced a new problem. Where would he spend the night? He didn't want to go home alone, but he had no close relatives in town. "You can stay at my place tonight," came a familiar voice. It was Emily, who had just arrived at the hospital with her father. "Mom called and told us what happened," she explained. "Dad said you can stay with us until your grandma is discharged." The kindness of this family, who barely knew him, moved Brian deeply. That night, for the first time in days, he slept peacefully, knowing his grandma was in good hands. The next morning, when he arrived at school, Brian was immediately called to the principal's office. His heart raced as he imagined being scolded for leaving mid-class. He knocked on the office door. "Come in, Brian," said Principal Michael, with a reassuring smile. "How's your grandmother doing?" "She's better, Principal, thank you for asking. The doctors said she should be discharged in a few days." "That's wonderful, I'm glad to hear it. I called you here to talk about your presentation yesterday." Brian swallowed hard, bracing himself for what might come next. "It was one of the best presentations I've ever seen at this school," the principal continued, surprising the boy. "All the parents there were impressed by your knowledge and how well you spoke." "Thank you, sir," Brian replied, relieved. However, the principal's expression turned serious. "There was an incident after you left." The boy's eyes widened with worry. "Professor Richard was quite upset. He claimed you somehow found out about a scientific article he published years ago and used it to embarrass him in front of everyone." Brian opened his mouth to defend himself, but the principal raised a hand, asking him to wait. I'm not here to accuse you of anything, Brian. I just want to understand what happened from your perspective. Honestly, Brian explained how he had stumbled upon the professor's article at the local library while researching for his project. He hadn't planned to expose the professor, but when directly questioned about theories on peripheral galaxies, he felt he couldn't ignore what he'd learned. I see, the principal said thoughtfully. You know, Brian, Professor Richard wasn't always the way he is now. Years ago, he was a young teacher passionate about science, with big dreams of becoming a recognized astronomer. The principal stood and walked to the window before continuing. That article you found was his big bet. He spent years researching that theory, only to see it torn apart by harsh criticism from the scientific community. It was a blow he never fully recovered from. Brian had never thought of the professor that way, as someone with broken dreams of his own. That doesn't excuse how he treats students, the principal went on. And I know I need to step in more firmly on that, but maybe it helps you understand the man behind the strict teacher a little better. The conversation gave Brian a new perspective. As he walked to class, he thought about how complex people are, rarely just good or bad. The morning passed normally, with one notable exception. Professor Richard didn't show up for his class. A teaching assistant took his place, handing out textbook exercises and looking relieved when the bell rang. At lunch, Brian's classmates acted differently around him. Some who'd never spoken to him before now asked about astronomy, impressed by his knowledge. Others inquired about his grandmother, showing concern they'd never expressed. You've become a celebrity, Emily remarked, sitting beside him in the courtyard. Everyone's talking about how you shut Professor Richard down. That wasn't what I wanted, Brian said, uncomfortable with the attention. I know, but guess what's even more surprising? Professor Richard called my mom last night to ask about your grandmother. I think he actually cares in his own way. The news stunned Brian. He couldn't imagine the stern professor showing concern for a student he'd once called mediocre. After school, Brian visited his grandmother at the community hospital. To his surprise, a small vase of flowers sat on her bedside table. Who brought these, Grandma? He asked, curious. One of your teachers, the science one. What's his name again? Professor Richard, Brian asked, disbelieving. Yes, that's the one. He came by this morning, very polite. We talked for a bit, and you know what he told me? That you gave an extraordinary presentation yesterday, that you have a lot of potential, and that he's going to help you develop it. Brian couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was it possible that the same teacher who had torn his work apart was now recognizing his potential? In the days that followed, while his grandmother recovered in the hospital, Brian kept attending school and staying at Jennifer's house. Professor Richard had returned to class, but his behavior was noticeably different. He was still demanding. But he no longer humiliated students when they made mistakes. Instead, he explained where they had gone wrong and how they could improve. That Friday, at the end of a turbulent week, the professor asked to speak with Brian after class. Johnson, I know we got off on the wrong foot, he said, visibly uncomfortable. I want you to know I recognize the quality of your work and your dedication. Brian just nodded, still wary of the professor's intentions. I'm organizing an astronomy club here at school, Richard continued. It'll meet Saturday morning so it doesn't interfere with regular classes. I'd like you to be one of the founding members. The offer took Brian by surprise. An astronomy club was exactly what he had always dreamed of, a chance to learn more about the subject that fascinated him so much. I'd love to, Professor, he replied with a genuine smile. Great. We'll start next Saturday, if your grandmother is home by then and you can join. That afternoon, when Brian visited Grandma Martha at the hospital, he told her about the professor's invitation. His grandmother smiled, happy to see the excitement on her grandson's face. See? Things are getting better, my boy. That project you put so much heart into ended up opening doors. It's true, Grandma. I never thought Professor Richard would change so much. As they talked, Jennifer's mother entered the room to check on Grandma Martha. Good news, the doctor announced after reviewing the test results. If she keeps improving like this, she can go home tomorrow. Brian couldn't contain his joy. Finally, things seemed to be falling into place. On Saturday morning, with his grandmother back home and recovering well, Brian headed to school for the first astronomy club meeting. To his surprise, he found not only Professor Richard, but also teacher Sarah Miller and 5 other students, including Jennifer. "Welcome to our club," the professor said with an enthusiasm Brian had never seen in him before. "Here, we'll explore the universe beyond the school curriculum. We'll dream big and look at the stars not just as points of light, but as worlds waiting to be discovered." The sparkle in the professor's eyes as he talked about astronomy revealed a passion that had been buried under years of bitterness and disappointment. It was as if a long-forgotten part of him was waking up again. The club's first activity was assembling a small telescope the professor had bought with his own money. As they worked together, Brian noticed how patient Richard was in explaining how the instrument worked, so different from his usual classroom demeanor. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot for those of us just starting out. Now back to the story. "Professor, can I ask you a personal question?" Brian said when the two of them were adjusting the telescope lens slightly apart from the others. Richard hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Why did you give up?" "Astronomy research?" Brian asked, gathering all his courage. "That paper I found, despite the criticism, it had some interesting ideas." The professor fell silent for a few moments, as if deciding whether to answer or drop the subject. Finally, he let out a sigh and said, "When that article was published, I was 28 years old and believed I would change the world of astronomy. I had dedicated years of my life to that theory. When the criticism came so harsh and relentless, something broke inside me." He paused, unnecessarily adjusting the telescope. "I had the chance to revise the theory, correct the calculation errors, but my pride wouldn't allow it. I preferred to abandon the research rather than admit I was wrong. Over time I became the professor you knew, bitter, overly demanding, unable to accept flaws in others because I never accepted my own." The honesty of that confession surprised Brian. He had never imagined having such a deep conversation with the professor who had once intimidated him so much. "You could still go back to research," the boy suggested. "It's never too late." "To start over." Richard smiled, a melancholy but genuine smile. "Maybe you're right, Johnson. Maybe it's time to look at the stars again with the eyes of a student, not someone who thinks they already know everything." That morning marked the beginning of a new phase for both of them. The astronomy club grew quickly in the following weeks, attracting more interested students. The telescope was just the beginning. Soon they were organizing visits to nearby observatories and participating in video calls with professional astronomers. At home, Brian noticed how much happier and calmer his grandmother seemed. With her health improving and seeing her grandson thriving at school, Grandma Martha seemed to grow younger. One morning, as they had breakfast together, she made an announcement. That left Brian stunned. "I got a call yesterday while you were at school," she said with a mysterious smile. "It was your father." Brian nearly choked on his bread. He hadn't heard from his father in over 3 years, not since he had left for Chicago, promising to return soon to bring the family with him. "My dad? What did he want?" he asked, trying to hide the mix of emotions flooding him. "He heard about the astronomy club," his grandmother explained. "Seems like the news reached Chicago. He said he's proud and he's coming back to visit us next month." The news left Brian with conflicting feelings. On one hand, there was joy at the thought of seeing his father after so long. On the other, resentment for the abandonment and broken promises. "I don't know if I want to see him," he admitted, lowering his eyes. "I understand, my boy," Grandma Martha replied with the wisdom of someone who had lived a long life. "But sometimes people deserve a second chance. Your father made mistakes, just like all of us. Maybe now is the time for you two to reconnect." Brian didn't answer, but his grandmother's words echoed in his mind. A second chance. Wasn't that exactly what had happened between him and Professor Richard? In the weeks that followed, the astronomy club prepared to participate in a regional science fair held in a nearby town. Brian and Emily worked together on a project about black holes, guided by Professor Richard. "This project has the potential to win first place," the professor remarked as he reviewed their work. "Your approach is original and well-founded." The praise filled Brian with pride. He had never imagined that one day he'd be praised by the same professor who had once torn his work apart in front of everyone. The day before the science fair coincided with the arrival of Brian's father in town. After many conversations with his grandmother and with teacher Sarah Miller, who had become a kind of mentor to him, the boy had finally decided to meet him. "No matter what happens, you've grown so much these past few months," the teacher said. "You're more confident, stronger. Your father is going to meet a different Brian from the boy he left behind." In the late afternoon, as Brian was putting the final touches on his project for the science fair, he heard a knock at the door. His heart immediately raced. He knew who it was even before opening it. Stephen Johnson was thinner, with a few new wrinkles on his face, but his smile was the same one Brian had kept in his memory. Beside him stood a young woman Brian didn't recognize. "Son," Stephen said, his voice choked, "look how you've grown." Brian stood frozen in the doorway, unsure how to react. Part of him wanted to hug his father, while another part wanted to demand answers for all the years of absence. "This is Jennifer," Stephen continued, gesturing to the woman beside him. "My wife." The revelation hit like a bomb. His father had remarried and hadn't even told him. "Why did you come back now?" Brian asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Because of this," Stephen replied, pulling a newspaper clipping from his pocket. It was a small article from the neighboring town about the new astronomy club at Franklin Adams Public School, highlighting how a student named Brian Johnson had inspired the initiative with his extraordinary work on the universe. "When I saw your name, I couldn't believe it," Stephen went on. "My son, following the path I abandoned." "What do you mean?" Brian asked, confused. "Your father was a physics teacher before he left for Chicago," Grandma Martha explained from the living room, where she'd been watching the scene. "And he was always passionate about astronomy, just like you." Brian looked at his father with new eyes. He'd never known that part of his past. "Come in," he finally said. "We have a lot to talk about." That night was full of revelations. Stephen told him how he'd given up his passion for teaching and astronomy after a series of disappointments, just as Professor Richard had done. How he'd gone to Chicago chasing quick money, but eventually realized he'd left behind what truly mattered. "When I read about you and this astronomy club, something woke up in me," Stephen admitted. "I realized it was time to fix my mistakes, to return to my roots." "And what do you plan to do now?" Brian asked, still cautious but starting to lower his guard. "Jennifer and I are moving back here," Stephen replied. "I got a job as a physics teacher at a public high school in the next town over. It's not much, but it's a fresh start." The news surprised Brian. His father really was planning to stay. This wasn't just another quick visit like before. "What about us?" Brian asked, cutting straight to what worried him most. "You disappeared. For years started another family." "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness right away, son," Stephen interrupted, sincerity in his voice. "All I ask is the chance to earn back your respect and trust little by little. If you'll let me, I want to be part of your life again." Brian looked at Jennifer, who had stayed quiet until then. "And you? What do you think about all this?" "Your father talks about you every day," she replied with a gentle smile. "It was my idea to come here. I think family is too precious to lose over pride or fear." Her words moved Brian. This woman, who could have seen him as an intruder or a complication, was actually helping bring father and son back together. "Tomorrow's the science fair," Brian said after a moment of thought. "If you want to come, it'd be nice to have you there." The smile on his father's face was answer enough. The next morning, Brian woke up early, nervous about the science fair and his father's presence. When he got to school, he found Professor Richard also visibly anxious. "Everything okay, Professor?" Brian asked, concerned. "Yes, Johnson, just a little nervous," he replied, trying to hide it. "This fair is important for all of us." As they set up the project display, the professor remained restless, frequently glancing toward the gymnasium entrance where the fair would take place. "Are you expecting someone?" asked Brian, curious. Before the professor could answer, Emily rushed over. "Brian, you won't believe this," she exclaimed excitedly. "One of the judges is an astronomer from MIT." Professor Richard Harrison's face paled at the news. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice tense. "Dr. William Parker," Emily replied. "Mom said he's very important in the field of astronomy." The professor took a deep breath, visibly shaken. "It's him," he murmured. "The main critic of my paper 20 years ago." Brian immediately understood why the professor was so nervous. Facing someone who had academically dismantled his work after so many years wouldn't be easy. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "I have to be," Richard replied, forcing a smile. "I can't let you down now." The fair officially began at 10 in the morning. The judges moved from display to display, evaluating projects and asking students questions. Brian spotted his father, Jennifer, and Grandma Martha among the visitors and discreetly waved at them. When Dr. William Parker finally approached the black hole project display, Professor Richard took a step back, letting Brian and Emily take over the presentation. The two teenagers explained the project with ease, confidently answering the astronomers' complex questions. Dr. Parker seemed genuinely impressed. "Who is the advisor for this exceptional project?" he asked at the end. "Professor Richard Harrison," Brian replied, gesturing toward the professor, who stood watching from a distance. The astronomer's eyes widened in recognition. "Richard Harrison? The author of that paper on peripheral galaxies?" The professor reluctantly stepped forward, extending his hand for a formal greeting. "Yes, Dr. Parker. The same one you tore apart in your critique 20 years ago." The comment created an awkward pause, but to everyone's surprise, the astronomer smiled. "Ah, Harrison, I've always wondered what happened to you. You know, your theory had calculation flaws, but the basic premise was fascinating. I always regretted that you abandoned research entirely." Now it was Professor Richard's turn to look surprised. "You thought my theory was fascinating. But your critical paper. That's how science works, my friend," Dr. Parker explained. "We critique, correct, and improve. It was never personal. In fact, in recent years, some aspects of your theory have been revisited by young researchers, using new data from space telescopes." The professor seemed unable to believe what he was hearing. The bitterness he had carried for 2 decades, rooted in the belief that his work had been dismissed as irrelevant, was being challenged right before him. "I'd love to discuss this further later," the astronomer continued, "but for now I must continue judging. This project of yours, kids, is among the best I've seen at school fairs. Congratulations." As Dr. Parker walked away, Professor Richard looked dazed. "Are you okay, Professor?" Brian asked, concerned by his expression. 20 years, Richard murmured. 20 years holding on to resentment when I could have kept working, corrected the mistakes. Brian placed a hand on the professor's shoulder in a comforting gesture, something unthinkable months ago. "It's never too late to start over," he said, repeating the words he had spoken during the astronomy club's first meeting. Just then, Stephen approached the display, accompanied by Grandma Martha and Jennifer. "Brian, your presentation was amazing," he praised, hugging his son with pride. "Dad, this is Professor Richard Harrison, my science teacher and advisor for the astronomy club," Brian introduced. The two men greeted each other, and something in Stephen's expression changed when he heard the name. "Richard Harrison, the author of that article on peripheral galaxies I used to reference in my physics classes." The professor looked at Stephen in surprise. "You know my work?" "Of course. I was a physics teacher before making some wrong choices in life. Your article had calculation flaws, true, but the ideas were revolutionary." "That's exactly what Dr. Parker just told me," Richard remarked, still processing it all. "After 20 years thinking my work was a complete disaster." "You two should talk more about this," Brian suggested, seeing a chance to bring 2 important people in his life closer. "My dad just moved back to town and will be teaching physics at the public high school." The professor nodded, still seeming a bit dazed by so many coincidences. "It would be interesting to exchange ideas with someone who actually read my work carefully," he said. The Science Fair award ceremony took place late that afternoon. To everyone's delight, Brian and Emily's project on black holes won first place in the exact sciences category. "This award is all yours," Professor Richard told the 2 students, as everyone celebrated. "You worked hard, and deserve all the recognition. "But we wouldn't have made it without your guidance, Professor," Brian replied sincerely. "You taught us so much more than astronomy these past few months." The professor's eyes shone with restrained emotion. How many times over the years had he missed the chance to truly teach, to truly connect with his students, because of his bitterness and resentment? As the fair ended and people began to disperse, Dr. Parker approached Professor Richard again. "I was thinking, Harrison," he began. "The university has an outreach project to bring astronomy to rural public schools. We need passionate, knowledgeable teachers. Someone like you would be a great fit." The proposal took the professor by surprise. I don't know if I'm up to it," he replied hesitantly. "It's been so long since I was involved in research." "That astronomy club you started says otherwise," the astronomer countered. "And these students have knowledge that could only come from an excellent mentor. Think about it and call me next week." As Dr. Parker walked away, Stephen approached again. "Don't pass up this opportunity, Professor," he advised. "Believe me, I know what it's like to set aside a passion and regret it later." The comment created an instant connection between the two men, who shared more than they realized. "Maybe I really should consider it," Richard reflected. "What about you? Are you really going back to teaching?" "Yes, I start next week," Stephen confirmed. "I want to make up for lost time in my career and—" He glanced at Brian, who was chatting excitedly with Emily and some other club members. "In my personal life, too." On the drive home, Brian sat quietly in the back seat of his father's car, thinking about everything that had happened over the past few months. From a humiliated student nearly failing, he had become a regional science fair winner and a key part of starting an astronomy club. From a boy resentful of his father's absence, he was now opening his heart to forgiveness and reconciliation. "What's on your mind, son?" Stephen asked, watching him in the rearview mirror. "How things can change completely in such a short time," replied Brian. "Just a few months ago, I hated going to school because of Professor Richard. I thought I'd never see you again, and now here we are," Stephen finished. "Life is full of these twists and turns. The important thing is to stay open to them, willing to forgive ourselves and others." Grandma Martha, sitting in the passenger seat, smiled at her son's words. After so many years of worry, she finally saw the family reconnecting. "What do you think about celebrating this award with a special dinner?" suggested Jennifer, who had been quietly listening to the conversation. "You must have a favorite restaurant in town, right?" "We do, actually," replied Grandma Martha. "A little pizzeria downtown. Brian has loved it since he was a boy." "Then it's settled," Stephen concluded. "We'll celebrate as a family." The word family sounded strange to Brian's ears. For so long his family had been just his grandmother. Now suddenly his father was back, and a stepmother who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him better. At the pizzeria, as they shared stories and laughter, Brian felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the feeling of being whole, of belonging. His phone buzzed with a message from Professor Richard. "Johnson, Dr. Parker has invited me to join a university outreach project. I'd like you and Emily to be my assistants on weekends. We need to talk about this on Monday." Brian smiled as he read the message. Another door opening, another opportunity to grow. "Good news?" asked Stephen, noticing his son's smile. "Great news," Brian replied, putting his phone away. "But we can talk about it later. Right now I just want to enjoy this moment." And there, in that simple pizzeria in rural North Carolina, gathered around a table, was a family that had been lost and found again. An imperfect family, marked by mistakes and regrets, but also by forgiveness and new beginnings. In the weeks that followed, many things changed in Brian's life. The project with Dr. Parker took shape, with Professor Richard coordinating astronomy workshops at schools across the region. Stephen rented a house near Grandma Martha's, allowing Brian to split his time between both homes, slowly rebuilding his relationship with his father. The school's astronomy club received new equipment, donated by the university, and more students signed up, inspired by their success at the regional science fair. Professor Richard, once feared by everyone, was now respected for his passion and knowledge, not just his strictness. On a starry August night, 3 months after the science fair, the club hosted a community stargazing event. Dozens of people showed up, lining up to see Jupiter and its moons through the telescope they'd acquired. Brian, now the club's official assistant, patiently explained to each visitor what they were seeing, with the same passion and knowledge that had made him stand out during that fateful presentation. "You've transformed, Johnson, Professor," Richard remarked, watching his student with pride. "And in a way, you've transformed me too." "I think we transformed each other, Professor," Brian replied. It took courage on both sides. As they talked, they spotted Stephen arriving with Jennifer and Grandma Martha. Brian's father had joined the astronomy club, offering to teach basic physics to the younger members. "I have a surprise for you," Stephen said to his son, handing him a small package. Brian carefully opened it and found an old book about constellations. On the first page, a handwritten dedication. "To my son Brian, who taught me it's never too late to look up at the stars again. With love, Dad." The boy's eyes welled up. It was the first gift he'd received from his father in years, and it couldn't have been more meaningful. "Thank you," he said, hugging his father tightly. At that moment, gazing at the starry sky above them, Brian thought about how surprising life could be. The teacher who had humiliated him had become his mentor. The father who had abandoned him was back trying to make amends. And he, a shy boy who had nearly failed, was now explaining the mysteries of the universe to dozens of people. Somewhere among the stars that fascinated him so much lay the most important lesson he'd learned, that people like the universe are constantly changing, and that even on the darkest nights, there are always stars shining, sometimes just waiting for us to find the courage to look up. The end of the story. And you? Have you ever experienced a situation where humiliation turned into triumph? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like. If Brian's story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming tales. Life is also about second chances, isn't it?